Okay, right. So today we are going into the second part of the Enlightenment. And it is in this period, and I assume all of you've looked at the lecture that I put up or recorded, um, where we looked at the first part of the Enlightenment, which was the 18th century. Again, just to remind you that we have broken this up into chronological periods, but there's serious overlap happening, right, between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. This is the at the first half of the Enlightenment into the second half of the Enlightenment. This is the early modern era. So we've tried to divide it, but it's life and it cannot necessarily be divided cleanly. Nonetheless, we've tried. And what we see in the 19th century is major revolution and what we call the scientific revolution. And it is in this part of the Enlightenment that we see major changes in medicine, and particularly the shift to the germ theory that revolutionizes the way, we operated, the way we thought about medicine and thought about disease, and therefore the systems that were put in place to adjust it. It was centuries of humoralism overturned in 1 century, really, and there was no turning back. It was science and science and science after that. As much as I like to say, there's no civilization and there's no culture where the dominant idea of it isn't just, it can't be undermined and dispelled. And that's true. The Enlightenment, you saw all of the different ways in which it wasn't enlightened. But, the argument here, the change here is so dramatic that if it's any period that we can argue went almost fully to the scientific, it's this period, okay? But, as I said, it's history, it's never clean, it's debatable, but we do have a significant moment here in terms of world history and definitely medicine. So the 19th century is considered the age of revolutions, right? Again, we started with the Renaissance, where we saw the age of exploration, where Europeans went out and discovered for themselves the new world, and they circumnavigated the globe. They, circumnavigated Africa and entered into Asia. All of these wonderful things were happening. But unfortunately, even though there was a revival after the Black Death and the Renaissance was, this period of illumination, and that continued into the early Enlightenment, the period of upheaval and the period of even exploration and understanding and its expansion of the world, unfortunately led to many revolutions. I shouldn't say unfortunately, it was fortunate for the people. There was a breaking up and a breaking down and opposition and rejection of, systems of authority, right? The power structures. And because of that, ultimately, it meant violent revolution in many ways, and certainly great change in terms of ideologies and in terms of structures that were put in place to support humanity. We have political revolutions, which, this is not new information to you. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution, we're talking about between 1776 to 1791, the latter part of the 18th century. Major changes taking place, the breaking up of the British Empire, the French monarchy and monarchical systems across Europe being undermined by the French Revolution, the rise of the democratic system and, republicanism, right? The rule by the people, representation by the people, and of course the Haitian Revolution, which overturns this question of enslavement and the plantation system, and the question of socioeconomic class, right, and race comes to the fore. And ultimately, these are both catalysts and reflections of the issues of the time. And again, as I said, the 19th century is going to be this period of turmoil politically. In addition to that, we have the Industrial Revolution. We have technology. This is going to be really the beginnings of change. The world is going to be almost completely different. This is the benchmark for technological advancement that we're going to see in the 20th century. You know, this is the beginnings of it, innovation and advancement in mechanization, particularly between 1760 and 1840. And thereafter, as I said, the world is going to look different in terms of production, in terms of manufacture, in terms of the way humanity is able to operate, to travel. It is this period that we're talking about that overturns centuries-old systems, ancient systems. Okay, and of course, with that, along with that innovation, along with the technological advancements, come what we consider the scientific revolution. Everybody's questioning everything, and so are the scientists, so are the medical professionals. And so we see the emergence of modern science, right? Mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, you name it. In this period, everyone is thinking and questioning, and we're seeing major developments in all of these areas, and science as we know it comes to the fore. So I've just laid the foundation for you for what we're going to talk about. And one of the major, most significant characters of the period of enlightenment, of the scientific revolution in relation to medicine, is Louis Pasteur. You have obviously heard of this man. You've heard the term pasteurization. Everybody drinks milk. To keep it as simple as possible, it is from this man that we are going to see the beginnings of the, or not even the beginnings, but really the breakup and the breakdown and the undermining of the miasmic theory and humoralism. He is the man that confirmed the germ theory. Now, remember, this was a theory that during even the late medieval period and the Renaissance period, a number of people began to propose the idea that, you know, Galenic ideas and theories about contagion and about just disease spread may have been incorrect, and even the anatomy and certain things, of course. But this is the man that ultimately confirms the germ theory. He's a French chemist and biologist. And what he was disproving specifically was this idea of spontaneous generation. Okay, it was believed, and you could well imagine that I wouldn't call them unscientific. They were somewhat unscientific minds at the time, or the science, but within the restrictions of the science of the day. Imagine looking at an organism that is decomposing. Okay, so scientists and doctors and so forth would see and examine, and researchers look at they would leave something out and watch it decomposing. And in their minds, something began to grow, okay, on the organism. And this is what they called, as I said, spontaneous generation, that in something started to just appear and to grow on these dead organisms, this corpse and so forth. And so it was this idea that organisms could be generated from non-living matter. Good, and that was spontaneous generation. He was the man who ultimately, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but he proved that it wasn't spontaneous generation that led to decomposition, but putrefaction. That it was in fact the organism that was being attacked by bacteria, right? That led to the change in the organism, okay? And ultimately, the body was broken down by bacteria. It wasn't something that was growing out of the body, but something that actually was attacking the body. And so this overturned the science, and ultimately Pasteur, you know, confirms the idea that disease could be spread by bacteria, and therefore it is germs and the spread of bacteria, spread of these germs that are going to carry disease and, you know, ensure that diseases are spread from person to person. So out of this, he was able, with the knowledge and the science that came before, of course, to develop vaccines. I'm simplifying Pasteur's work in a significant way, but yeah, we don't have time to do a whole lesson on Pasteur, but just know that he ultimately was able to develop vaccines. Anthrax vaccine was one of the first. He tested it on sheep. He actually set up an experiment and invited reporters. He vaccinated certain animals and didn't vaccinate some of them, and the reporters came and recognized that those that were unvaccinated got sick and eventually died. And in that way, he was able to prove that vaccines did work. And from there, his fame exploded. He would go on, of course, to develop the rabies vaccine, and rabies was a horrible problem for both animals and man. And further to that, chicken cholera, which was a horrific disease, and we're going to talk about the cholera. It was cholera, right? Horrible. But the cholera epidemic that was plaguing the world around the time that he would have been working. And so he made a major impact on medicine and changed the way people thought about disease and understood disease. And from hereafter, the humoral theory and the theory of miasma began to really be debunked. And Pasteur himself, as I said, he gained in fame, and eventually there were numerous Pasteur institutes that were open throughout Europe, right? Major cities, in the major centers of Europe. We have institutes that are and still exist today that continue to do this kind of research and work on finding vaccines and combating diseases. There were other advances, of course, in the scientific revolutionary period. One of the major ones, of course, was anesthesia, right? Put forward by quite a few different scientists at the time. In 1846, we have William Thomas Morton. He is going to, find a way, and anesthesia is basically about knocking people out before they could perform surgery. And I want you to keep in mind that before anesthesia, they would have practiced and used various other drugs to try and to knock people out, right? To knock you unconscious so that they could perform whatever operation, whatever surgery on you. But these were not regulated, they were not tested, and quite often the person may never have woken up. So it was either do something and use something that they were not sure about, or and then possibly endanger the patient, or the patient could just bite down, which they would usually give you a piece of wood or a piece of cloth and put it between your tongue and your teeth so that you wouldn't swallow your tongue as you writhe in pain while they operated. And the person might have actually died from shock. So, you weighed your options. You're going to try something untested, or you're just going to suffer through. Most people, of course, suffer through, and most of the times the doctors didn't have anything to use. And so a lot of people simply died on the table when they were being operated on because they just weren't able to render them unconscious while they were doing the operation. So this was a significant moment where you have Morton and later Simpson, who's going to try chloroform. And I think I have a picture of them. I think this was Morton working on ether. He actually, and of course, remember, this is the era in which you couldn't necessarily just experiment on anyone and anything, right? The church was still heavily involved and kind of regulated, even though there were revolutions occurring. There was still a moral kind of structure in place where, it would have looked bad. You may not have necessarily been arrested, but it would have defamed you if you had killed somebody, or if you not killed, you would have been arrested if you killed them, but if you had hurt somebody in your research. And so we have them trying ether on themselves, and this is the image of them trying ether on themselves, a drawing showing, yeah, they tested it on themselves and they passed out, right? And they tested how long they would have passed out or been unconscious. So anesthesia was a major development, a major innovation of the time.
So with the medical fraternity now fully embracing the idea of the germ theory, bacteria and contagion, they now turn their attention to preventing infection, right? To either killing the bacteria or finding a way to hindering its spread. So one of the concepts that came into play at the time was antiseptics, right? And the concept of disinfection, killing or hindering the spread of bacteria using different concoctions, different chemicals to do so. Joseph Lister, of course, was one of the main proponents of this and advocates of this. And in 1865, he came up with the use of carbolic acid to do just that as an antiseptic. He created as well the antiseptic sprayer and encouraged its use in surgeries at the time. You have what we call the Listeran operation. And this is, of course, where they would use the sprayer during the procedure and spray it periodically to ensure that the there was disinfection taking place during the operation, right? And to protect the open wound from attack by bacteria. This was always a fascinating thing to think about. We also have sterilization, right, where they attempted to actually kill bacteria prior to the operation. And so this, of course, meant that they would have to treat the equipment that was being used, and even the area that was, going to be utilized for the operation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's look specifically at the invention of the autoclave, which was a pressure steam sterilizer invented by Ernst von Bergmann in 1880, again, to sterilize the equipment that would be used during operations to kill bacteria. So this concept of sterilization came into play in a strong way, again, attacking the germs that would cause and the bacteria that would cause the infections that killed so many for centuries. But another type of consideration occurred, and it had to do with the fact that, it's one thing to kill bacteria, to prevent, to hinder bacteria, that you're working under the assumption that bacteria was present, right? Aseptic techniques were techniques that were developed to prevent bacteria from even entering the operation theater or the space in which the human body would be exposed and vulnerable to it, right? So it was the idea of preventing contamination by bacteria and not just assuming that, there would be. So in the 1870s, you have Robert Lawson Tate, and between the 1880s to the 20th century, you have William Halstead working on this significantly, developing aseptic techniques among the medical fraternity, those who were intimately involved with dealing with cases, operating and handling patients, that there was, for instance, no talking or little talking taking place over somebody who's undergoing an operation, hand scrubbing, wearing gowns, using rubber gloves on your hands. All of these things came into play to simply prevent bacteria and the spread of bacteria. So rather than, where you have antiseptic concepts and disinfection killing, sterilization killing, you have this idea that let's prevent it from the beginning. All right. And of course, they all worked in tandem to create the best space possible to protect the human being as they were being treated and operated on. And of course, all of these came from this understanding of the germ theory?
Disease and the categorization and identification of disease, different diseases, also, of course, came to the fore in the era as science and research advanced, particularly Manson, who was working in China around 1877. And he is the one that identified that insects were vectors of disease. He was looking specifically at malaria, and working with that particular um, ailment. And ultimately, he identified, listen, insects can carry disease. So even though when we're talking about the Black Death, we're tossing about all the scientific information about, we know that the fleas were on the rats and transferred. They didn't have a clue before this. They didn't have an idea that it was the fleas that were transferring the bacillus, from the rats to the human bloodstream. Now they do. So now we know to prevent disease, we can attack the insects. It's not anything that we need to necessarily do it ourselves specifically, but we can, before we're infected, we could go into the vector sites and kill them off, right? Or prevent them from getting to the human and infecting us. So this was huge. Robert Koch is also going to, remember, we spoke about how awful tuberculosis was in 1882. He identifies and isolates the tubercle bacillus. And then later on, cholera, the Vibrio of cholera Vibrio in 1883. Major diseases. As I said, cholera was a pandemic, so it's basically as though he comes up and identifies, what in, let's say, today's world, he identified what is causing COVID-19. And so this would have been huge back in the 1880s. And then, of course, Ronald Ross, he's the one that discovers the malaria parasite specifically. And so his work has major implications for the colonial world, right, where there were numerous infections, particularly as well in Africa and in the Caribbean, and in the southern areas of North America. This is going to be a significant piece of information and work. So in 1897, we have Ross working on malaria. Hospitals as well changed their function in the Enlightenment, since it became more scientific, more research oriented, and they began to isolate diseases. So it wasn't simply a place where deviant groups would congregate or places of charity. It was now focused on research on curing diseases. So even though a number of doctors over centuries would have been trained at hospitals, it still was not a place where you would want to be. Okay, it was not a place largely about research. Most people went there to die, right? You went to the hospital, and unfortunately, even up to the 1950s, it may have been a place in many societies where you only went there when you were at your most severe and you knew you were going to die. It was more about palliative care rather than cure and curative care. And so, unfortunately, the hospital was not the cleanest, the most sanitary place. All these changes that we're talking about, these discoveries came, but the changes would take place in the early parts of the 20th century. Around now, it's still not necessarily a nice place. But over time, changed, and they began to be more focused on illness and curing diseases, and in also what I call the privilege of separation. They are going to identify certain diseases that determine that need to be isolated. And so they build different types of hospitals, voluntary hospitals, public hospitals are built, and asylums are built in this period in a significant way. If we even look at the Caribbean, for instance, this is the period where the Port of Spain General Hospital is built, the Kingston General Hospital, colonial hospitals are built, the St. Anne's, Salsville, you may not know, our mental asylum is called St. Anne's, right? Because it was opened in St. Anne's, Port of Spain. And that was, built as well in this period, the 1850s, 60s, and so forth. And so we're seeing these changes taking place in Europe and all across the world and in the different empires and so forth, where hospitals are being built and constructed and research is taking place here. So again, as I said, this idea of separation and specialization, we have new wards even within these hospitals: obstetrics, pediatrics, orthopedics, ear, eye, and throat diseases section and units. Before, you were on the bed. Remember in the medieval period when we looked at these hospitals, you were on a bed, you came in with tuberculosis, but you're lying down next to somebody with malaria and enteric fever, right? You're lying down next to somebody who had broken their leg. They were all lumped together in the same ward. Now we have separation taking place in a more specific way in the period of the Enlightenment, as more research and more focus on medicine and science is occurring. Now, let's talk about women. Where have women been in this story, and how does their role change in this period? Women, as we know, have been very dominant as nurses. Yes, we saw the rise of the medieval nurse sister, the nuns who were working in the medieval hospitals. Women have always been, of course, in the home, and they've always been the assistants. Now, they begin to challenge the upper echelons of the medical fraternity and demand their entrance into higher level and into the realm of doctor and physician. Now, we do know about, remember we spoke about Trota and Trotula, that there were women, we believe, that operated as doctors, but we aren't sure because there was no real, there's no real information about them, okay? And they were clearly predominantly, as I said, there may have been few women who may have broken through, right? Fallen through the cracks, as a misogynistic male would say. But in large part, women were kept out of the university system and the regulated training programs for medical practitioners. In the Enlightenment, particularly second half of it, that is when women break and begin to break the glass ceiling. One of the first was Elizabeth Blackwell, coming out of the United States in 1849. She she attempted, and there are about 3 of them. I think I only showed 2 here, but she decided that she wanted a medical degree and she fought for it. Now, she ended up going to the Geneva Medical School in New York, and she received her a medical degree. She had to petition. These are not women who are going to be able to just walk in and apply. Most of these women got into medical school because there was no stipulation that said they could not. And the reason that there was nothing written that said women could not become doctors is because it was unheard of. They didn't even have to write that. Nobody even expected women to apply. So these women would have gotten in, and let me put the other one as well, gotten into, so like Elizabeth Garrett, she's the first woman in Britain in 1865. They got into these medical schools because when they applied and the board sat, legally they couldn't tell them no, because in their constitution, there was nothing that said that women could come in. So they fought for their position. But when they got into the position, people like Blackwell and Garrett, when they went into these schools, they were persecuted often by their male classmates and their lecturers. In fact, at times there were mobs of protesters outside of their dorm spaces, or when they entered their classrooms, or when they entered the halls, or they were walking through campus. People jeered them. People were like, go back to your home. it was a horrible experience for them to enter these theaters that were not made for women. And they did it knowing that this was the only way for legitimacy in the profession. And there were times as well when they were denied, right? So, for instance, Garrett, she applied to for a medical degree in Britain and they told her no. So she ended up going to the University of Paris. So there were times when they outright denied them, but most of these universities could not. But nonetheless, it is these women who actually gained a medical degree who began to open hospitals and training facilities for other women. So we credit these early pioneers, these female pioneers, with providing the necessary opportunities for training of other female physicians and, you know, opportunities for women to break into the system. So for instance, Blackwell, she opened a New York infirmary for indigent women to help other women, right? Focus largely on women, but also she worked with other women and female doctors. Garrett did the same. She opened the St. Mary's dispensary for women. So these women recognized that women's health was different and needed, and there was a specialization that was being ignored, and they opened hospitals specifically for women. Okay. And in 1874, for instance, Garrett would go on to open the London School of Medicine for women. So we do note in this period. Do I have a picture of her? Oh, poor thing, I didn't put up a picture. There's Garrett, right? So women doctors are now breaking into the system at great risk to their self, right, and their reputations, but they are doing it. And so we do have some very early examples of that in the mid to late 19th century. But in terms of nursing, as I said, this had been the female position. This is her area. This was her forte. Women owned and they operated as nurses. But to say that it was recognized as a profession, it was more that they were assistants to the doctors. And it was only with the emergence of prominent female nurses who gained renown and respect at a particular level and from a particular group that we will see change taking place in terms of the attitude towards the nursing profession or nurses in general. It becomes more of an organized professional group in the period of the Enlightenment than ever before. We credit a lot of this to Florence Nightingale. How many of you have heard of Florence Nightingale? Everybody. What do you know about Florence Nightingale?
I've just heard the name, but I don't really, like from TV, just the name.
Right. That's typical. People, you've heard of Florence Nightingale for sure. Very famous name, but you're not sure why. You're not sure where. You know, maybe nursing, but no details. Florence Nightingale came to prominence during the Crimean War. Okay. She was a woman of privilege. She was of the wealthy class, right? And of noble class. She was not somebody who was poor. She was a genteel woman. And unfortunately, a war broke out between Russia, France, and Britain, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Just, you could go do your research on the Crimean War, but we're talking about an Eastern European war here that is going to lead to a number of British garrisons, right, soldiers going to war in that theater. Now, unfortunately, when they entered the war front, right, when they got to the war front, they were not winning. Okay, they met with great opposition, and unfortunately, they did not walk with enough doctors and certainly insufficient nurses. So I have a quote here: not only were there not sufficient surgeons, not only were there no dressers and nurses, there was not even linen to make bandages. So they sent men to the war front, and they met extremely poor conditions and um, uh, an enemy that was unwavering in their efforts to oust them. And they had no medical assistance to support these men going into the Crimean War. And so information started to filter back to Britain about the conditions of these men and how many men were actually dying. So the fatality rates, and the British public was horrified by what was occurring. And Nightingale took it upon herself to approach the government and ask them to form a group, right? And she would find nurses to send to the front. And so she, as head nurse, gathered 38 nurses with her and went to Scutari, okay, which is in Turkey, right? And began to take care of the men on the front. And it is her work there that brought her the acclaim. Yes, going was, of course, a wonderful idea. But when she got there, she started to clean. She started to put things in order. She, in fact, was a great statistician. She was a mathematician, right? So we're talking about a very brilliant, intelligent person. And she put her mind towards that. She organized meals, beddings, the linen. She set up a routine and ultimately reduced the death rate from 40% to 2%. Okay? 40% to 2% in her time there. And so, obviously, knowledge of this got back to Britain and the overseas empire, and Florence Nightingale became the most famous nurse in the Enlightenment period. Upon her return to England after the war, she would produce literature to support the idea of nursing as a profession. Because, as I said, she went across there and she put in regulation and organization to a system that was probably, of course, Scutari, there were problems, but in terms of nursing, people knew how to nurse. Women knew how to nurse. There were great nurses, throughout the centuries, but nobody had done it on this scale, and nobody had done it and then written about it and put it down on paper, how to nurse and how to create a profession out of this and how to become a professional nurse. And she, in fact, opened a nursing school and began to teach women how to nurse. It is from her work and in this period that we actually going to see the establishment of the Overseas Nursing Association, that is going to send nurses into the colonies, right? And that is how, places like Trinidad and the rest of the Caribbean and the British Empire got trained nurses from Britain coming out to assist in the development of our systems. So she helped in the development of nursing, as a profession. And she also produced work that shared her knowledge, and she taught women in general how to nurse. So for instance, in her 1859 notes on nursing, she explains, the following notes is a preface, right? The following notes are by no means intended as a rule of thought by which nurses can teach themselves to nurse, still less as a manual to teach nurses to nurse. They are meant simply to give hints for thoughts to women who have personal charge of the health of others. And she goes on. I can leave this here for now, because I do want to get to one other person who's very important for you to know. But she will write and, as I said, produce literature that's going to support the profession, and then she opens schools that supports the profession. These are images of what she built at in the Crimean warfront, right? The Scutari Hospital in particular stands out as one of her main achievements. And you can see here how she was more a believer in the miasmic theory than she was in the germ theory, even though the kind of things that she did supported the eradication of bacteria and germs and whatnot. She believed that ventilation was important. And so the hospital, she felt, should not be some closed up, very overcrowded place, but it should be open, and wards should be open and with big windows, and so that the wind could blow through, and there would be very good ventilation. She also believed that you should be able as a nurse to see all of your patients. So there shouldn't be partitions between patients, but there should be a nursing station at the entrance, but the nurse should be able to see. Okay, so air should flow, there should be clear line of sight. And this is important because this is actually going to inform hospital construction. So hospitals, if you look at the modern hospital, it is built often, according to where it is, of course, it is built like an apartment building, right? So, it goes pretty high. It's not a sprawling thing. But if you looked at the hospitals that were built back in the day, so even the Port of Spain Hospital and most hospitals, they needed to be you need to have a lot of land to build these sprawling buildings and these sprawling hospitals with these wide open wards and these wide open spaces and lots of ventilation. It was because of the theory of miasma. And often you would find these hospital wards called Nightingale wards because it was her design. Okay, so Florence Nightingale made a major impact. So here we have an example of a pavilion style ward, a Nightingale ward, where it may not have been as sprawling as we saw in the last drawing, but still it's an open ward, no partitions between the patients. The nurse can see every patient, and the head nurse can see every patient. And of course, you have lots of windows, lots of air, lots of light. And so she didn't only make an impact on nursing, right, but on the hospital system and hospital construction and architecture as well. So we're talking about a major character in relation to Enlightenment medicine and medicine in general, the history of medicine in general. But there is one person that, as Caribbean people and as people who are knowledgeable about medicine and nursing, you should know about. And that person is Mary Seacole. How many of you have heard of Mary Seacole?
I have, but just a quick question. Was it that Seacole actually went to Florence Nightingale and asked to be a nurse, and Nightingale turned her down, something like that?
Yes. That's how you've heard something about that.
Yeah, I kind of tied it when I read up on her bit.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else has ever heard about her?
No, unfortunately, I never heard about her.
Right.
Yeah, me neither.
Okay. So that's why we have to teach this course. This is why I'm here. Mary Seacole deserves recognition right alongside Florence Nightingale. Though her impact may not have been as widespread for obvious reasons, she made a significant contribution to nursing, and it is her story that also speaks to the discrimination that the Black nurse or nurses of color faced in the era. And I call this the West Indian contribution because Mary Seacole was Jamaican, and she, in fact, as I said, is being recognized now, and her story is being told to kind of put into perspective Florence Nightingale's legacy. Okay, as Kyle mentioned. But as I said, she was Jamaican, and in fact, there's a Mary Seacole Hall in Mona Cave, in Mona, UWI, the University of the West Indies, UWI. There's a Mary Seacole Residence Hall. So she's gained recognition in the 20th century. But let's talk about what she actually did. Mary Seacole, she was an expert in folk medicine, what we call bush medicine, tropical, traditional medicine, and particularly tropical diseases. She was of mixed heritage, right? Her mother was a free African woman, and her father was a Scottish sailor. So she, as I said, was of mixed heritage. And her mother, and as I said, she was born in Jamaica, but her mother was a traditional healer as well, right? Very, very practiced in herbal medicine, and knowledgeable about herbal medicine and practiced in bush medicine. And in fact, the mother ran a hostel and hospital in Jamaica for a long time, which is where she learned and gained knowledge of her art. And it is through her work in Jamaica, in this hostel, which ran also as a hospital, the mother worked out of there as well, that she met a lot of British soldiers and sailors. She would eventually marry, and her husband died, and she moved to Panama for a bit, and she worked with a lot of soldiers there as well, and she was actually very instrumental in helping with a cholera epidemic, a cholera outbreak in Panama, using herbal remedies, right? So we know that about her, that she knew the art, she was an expert in the art, and she practiced. As I said, she had met a number of British soldiers, a number of British sailors when she was in Jamaica and her work in the Caribbean. And so at the outbreak of the Crimean War, when knowledge about the condition started to spread to the rest of the world and the British Empire, she was moved because she knew these men. She knew a lot of the men that had gone to war. And so she took it upon herself to travel to London to offer her services, to volunteer. And so she actually went to Florence, she went to the British authorities, and she asked them if she could join Florence Nightingale, she could travel and join Florence Nightingale and her nurses. And she was shut down. They said they ignored her request. She eventually, with the help of one of her friends, raised enough money to be able to travel to Scutari, to Turkey, to the Crimean War front, okay, to offer her services. And she went to Florence Nightingale at the Scutari Hospital and at her base, and she, volunteered to work. And unfortunately, Florence Nightingale turned her down. And she wrote an autobiography afterwards. I'll show you a picture of the cover of it. And it is in that she explained that she was put in a room, in a flea-infested room overnight, right? So she got there and they couldn't just kick her out. They put her in, they told her no. Florence Nightingale met with her and told her no. And then they put her in a room with bed bugs on the bed, okay? This is Florence Nightingale. These are nurses. This is not something that, they would let go. They knew what they were doing, and basically kicked her out the next morning. Mary Seacole, with the friend who had helped fund her trip, was able to establish her own hostel and at the war front, right? She was able to open her own hostel, and from there would render medical assistance and service to British and other soldiers. She would actually go to the war front and work on men as the battle moved on. She would go and she would actually work on them and help them and bandage and do whatever else she did. The hotel that she opened was called, let me just tell you what she said in an excerpt about the rejections by Florence Nightingale. She read in, and this is before, sorry, she left. Left England. I read in the recruiter's face the fact that had there been a vacancy, I should not have been chosen to fill it. Doubts and suspicions rose in my heart for the first and last time, thank heaven. Was it possible that American prejudices against color had some root here? Did these ladies shrink from accepting my aid? This is when she had gotten to by Florence Nightingale, of course. Did they shrink from accepting my aid because my blood flowed beneath a somewhat duskier skin than theirs? So in her book, she's clearly intimating that, there's racism at the root of her rejection. Okay, but this is the hostel she built. It was called the British Hotel. And this is just a sketch of it, okay? And she was able to establish on the ground floor a general store and restaurant because of course she had to raise funds to support herself and support the hospital. Remember, she went there to nurse. She didn't go there to make money, but she had to find a way. If she wasn't being funded by the British government and Florence Nightingale, she had to find a way to do this thing. And so she opened a little general store and a little restaurant. And by restaurant, don't exaggerate. People came in and they sold theirs and then they got a little bit of food and whatnot. She also sold alcohol. And this, of course, was something that unfortunately came back to bite her. But she fed them, gave them drink, and she healed them. And she upstairs was a hospital and a little boarding house, again, for her to make money. But her work with those men, she was highly credited for it by them. Right, the soldiers knew this woman and they knew her well. And, this is an image of the ground floor of the British Hotel. The men flocked to her for treatment. And so she made an impact on this one in a significant way, and she did it under incredible odds. Here we have, again, just lots of drawings and images appeared in the newspapers about this woman, particularly after the war, and about the work that she did. And this is just another example of her helping and so forth. After the war ended, unfortunately, Sequel, when she came back, she was bankrupt. Right? She didn't raise money. She went to help and she wasn't paid for the work that she did. And so she, unfortunately, got into serious financial straits. And the soldiers that she helped in Jamaica and who she ran to help in the Crimean War, they came together and said, no, we can't let this happen to this great woman. And they started a campaign to help her. And they threw benefit activities organized by, the newspapers and the veterans, people who knew about the work that this woman had put forward, and they raised money for Sequel. The Sequel Fund was established to help her. And she, in fact, this is when she wrote the autobiography as well, The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Sequel in Many Lands, which you can get your hands on. It's still being published, and to support herself. And so it was clear that in the aftermath of the war, there was recognition for her, and people knew about Mary Sequel. The men knew about Mary Sequel. I tell you, there were newspaper articles about the work that this woman did and so forth. But over time, it faded to the point where even in the West Indies, nobody even knew about this woman. You understand? And still today, we're teaching about Mary Sequel. We now have it's a resurgence of knowledge about her and her story that has led us to this point where we're actually teaching about Mary Sequel, and people are now beginning to know about Mary Sequel. But she was just as famous as Florence Nightingale at a point in time, right? Maybe not in the empire, but definitely in Britain. So what has happened, of course, as I said, her decline, I found this in an 1856 magazine that, spoke about, and this was again to raise funds and sympathy for her. She gave her aid to all in need, to hungry, sick, and cold, open hand and heart, ready to give, kind words and acts and gold. And now the good soul is in a hole. What soul there in all the land? To set her on her feet again won't give a helping hand. And so, again, just to show that she was recognized, and there was a whole campaign, her work was recognized, and there was a whole campaign to help this lady. And as I said, her knowledge about her died, but in the latter part of the 20th century, there was a resurgence of information and knowledge about her work and recognition for her. They republished the autobiography in 1984. In 1981, she was actually recognized in Jamaica. She was given the Order of Merit in Jamaica, and they named a ward after her, the public hospital, as I said, a university. At the University of the West Indies, they named a hall of residence after Mary Seacole. Okay, she's been put on stamps. There's a movement in the UK to recognize her and to also not necessarily taint Florence Nightingale's image, but to put it in perspective and in context. Florence Nightingale, when she returned, when Florence Nightingale returned, she did not speak well of Mary Seacole. She said that she was running a brothel and that she was serving alcohol, which, you know, meant that she was basically running a free-for-all, you know, whorehouse. And she said those things about her. And in fact, later on, she had to apologize for saying those things. But nonetheless, it spoke to the issues of the day in terms of race and socioeconomic class. Mary Seacole's story gives a clear indication of what was happening at the time, you know, in colonial centers and with colonial people, and their engagement and recognition and you know, as citizens. They were considered British citizens, but what kind? And we're talking about a period, of course, where enslavement is, the issues of enslavement are still playing out, you know, and post-emancipation and whatnot. But Mary Seacole's work cannot be ignored, and what she did and the odds she faced, and particularly the fact that she's West Indian, we should know about her and we should be speaking about her. But you hear more about her in Britain, right? And in Black Britain than you hear about her here. They've actually, as I said, they have stamps now. Jamaica's trying. So they actually have, you know, as I said, she appears on stamps, recognition of her. There's a bust in Los Angeles of Mary Seacole at the Getty Center. So there has been growing recognition, but nonetheless, not enough, and definitely not enough in the Caribbean. Okay, so I think that's my last slide. No, here we have again Mary Seacole. Yeah, so there's been a play. I think there's a movie coming out. It's yes, 2021. They're producing this movie, right? The Mary Seacole Center, I believe, in Britain is producing this movie, and so soon enough she will be on mainstream media and popular culture, and her story will be as well. Okay, but we need to know about her. We need to acknowledge her and recognize the work that this woman did, right alongside Florence Nightingale, who is the most renowned nurse in history. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up here.